The whisper was so soft it should have died inside the stone. But midnight carried it upward through the chapel corridor and laid it at Matteo Vescera's feet like a blade. "Tomorrow he signs," Emilia said in the dark to a man the house had no reason to shelter at that hour. "Once the papers are sealed, you take the child and leave Italy before dawn. He must never know." Below them, the last notes of the quartet from their wedding eve reception still floated through the marble halls of Villa del Amber, thin and glittering as shattered glass. And the woman who was supposed to become his wife at noon stood beneath a fresco of saints with her face lifted toward another man, pale as candle wax, while the stranger touched her wrist with the intimacy of a vow. Matteo did not move. Men like him were feared for their rage. But the more dangerous thing was the stillness that came before it. And in that moment something inside him went so silent it almost sounded like grief. The villa sprawled above the Ligurian coast like an inheritance from another century. All terraces and cypress shadows and ancient balustrades facing a moonlit sea. Crystal chandeliers burned in the grand ballroom. Silver trays still gleamed under the hands of departing staff. In the olive gardens, hired violinists were packing their instruments while guests drifted toward guest suites or smoking terraces, laughing softly beneath the illusion that tomorrow would be beautiful. Matteo stood alone in the upper corridor near the old family chapel, one hand resting on the cold stone wall, his tailored black jacket open. His tie loosened just enough to suggest a human fatigue that few people were ever allowed to see. He had crossed this corridor because he had been looking for Emilia. Because she had vanished without explanation an hour earlier. Because he had noticed even before the missing bodyguard near the west stairwell that something in the air of his house had shifted. Then her voice had reached him, then that sentence. Then the stranger in the shadow below leaned close enough for Matteo to see the gleam of a silver signet ring and hear the answer. Low and smooth and unmistakable. "You've done well," said Alaric Dicini, the man Matteo had trusted for 15 years. "Just keep smiling until the ceremony. And after that there were no violins left in the world." Alaric was elegant, shaped into a weapon. Silver hair, precise manners. The kind of old money patience that made other men rush into mistakes. He had once negotiated peace between families who had been trying to bury one another for a generation. He had helped Matteo's father build the legal empire that hid the criminal one. He had stood beside Matteo at funerals, at board meetings, at the grave of Matteo's younger brother, telling him that discipline was what remained after loss had burned everything softer away. He was 62 years old, senator, attorney, strategist, and one of the only men alive who could walk unarmed through a room full of killers and make them lower their eyes first. Emilia stepped back from him now, as if his nearness repulsed her. But fear and betrayal looked too similar in half-light to a man who had just heard the wrong sentence. "I said I'd do it," she whispered. "I did not say I trusted you." Alaric smiled with that faint, civilized cruelty Matteo had once mistaken for wisdom. "Trust is for children and lovers. Tomorrow is for signatures." Matteo left before either of them knew he had been there. He descended the servant staircase rather than the main one, passing portraits of dead Vescara ancestors whose painted faces watched him with the merciless calm of people who had ruined other people's lives to preserve their own names. In the mirrored gallery, 2 guards straightened when they saw him. But one look at his face made them look away again. By the time he reached his private office behind the library, he had already made 3 decisions. The first was that the wedding would not happen. The second was that no one would know why until he understood how deep the lie went. The third was that if Emilia Rinaldi had been playing him while standing inside his house, wearing his ring, sleeping under his protection, then he would tear the truth out of the foundations of Europe if he had to. He closed the office door, poured himself a drink he did not touch, and stared at the illuminated chessboard on the table near the window. A habit he kept from his father, who had believed strategy should always be practiced in beauty. The Black King remained upright under the lamp while everything around it looked ready to burn. Emilia returned to her suite at 12:43 with salt in her hair and fear hidden badly beneath composure. The room prepared for the bride glowed with candles and hand-cut roses. A silk gown the color of antique ivory waited behind glass. Jules slept on velvet, through the French doors. Moonlight washed the sea until it looked almost holy. She removed her earrings first. Then the diamond ring second, but only for a moment. Only long enough to press her fingers against the ache the stone left behind. Matteo had chosen it without consulting a jeweler, which meant he had chosen it alone. Which meant more than anyone in society understood. He did very little alone unless it mattered. When she looked up and found him in the reflection of the dark window, standing in the open doorway with one hand in his pocket and his face unreadable, she did not scream. Amelia was not a woman who wasted emotion in ways that could later be used against her. She turned carefully, slid the ring back on and said, "You should knock." Matteo closed the door behind him. "You should tell me where you were." He spoke without raising his voice. And that was worse. Amelia had seen Matteo Vescara in newspapers. In whispered anecdotes, in the terrible imaginative folklore that grew around powerful men. She had met a version of him the public never could have understood. Quiet. Controlled, capable of startling gentleness toward old women, children, and exhausted staff. A man who remembered which flowers gave her headaches. A man who had once stood in the rain outside a church in Siena for 2 hours because she had asked for time, before agreeing to the engagement that saved her life. Their arrangement had begun in necessity. Her father, a restoration mason who had worked on Vescara properties for decades, had died after leaving her a key and a warning. Days later, someone had broken into her apartment, searched the walls, and nearly killed her on a dark Florentine street. Matteo had intervened before the second attempt could happen. His public proposal had made society call it romance. In truth, it had been protection, then partnership, then something neither of them had named because naming it would have required trust. Now he stood before her with that trust turning to ash. "In the chapel corridor," he said, "at midnight." With Alaric, she felt the blood leave her face, but she kept her chin level. "You heard me. Enough. Then you didn't hear the right part." He took one slow step toward her. "Say it." Her throat tightened. This was the moment she had feared since Alaric had sent the first note. Since she had realized the child was not a rumor but real. Since she had understood that the only men dangerous enough to threaten Matteo were the ones he had once loved as family. "I can't," she said, and the truth of it broke her voice more than she wanted. Matteo's eyes hardened, though not with shouting or cruelty. Wounds had made him colder than most men's anger. "Can't," he repeated almost softly. "Or won't." Amelia looked at him across a room full of expensive light and knew that whatever existed between them had reached the cliff edge. "If I tell you tonight, someone dies before morning," she said. "Maybe more than one. Do you expect me to believe that secrecy is loyalty?" "No," she said. "I expect you to know I would not stand in a chapel trembling like a criminal if this were simple." For a brief second something flickered in him. Something nearly human enough to be pain, but suspicion buried it fast. "Tomorrow there will be no wedding," he said. "At breakfast you will smile. You will behave as if the ceremony is delayed for private reasons. You will remain under my protection until I know whether you are being used or whether you intended to use me." Amelia inhaled once, deeply to stop the humiliation from reaching her eyes. "And if I refuse?" "You won't," he said. Not as a threat but as certainty. "Because whatever this is, you're afraid of something that frightens even you." Morning broke over the villa in pale gold and false calm. Guests descended grand staircases in linen and diamonds. Coffee service moved through sunlit lodges. News of the postponed wedding rippled politely through a house trained in secrets. "Illness," said the official explanation, "a family legal matter, a private delay." The older women pretended to believe it. The younger ones stared at Amelia over porcelain cups with the hunger of people who preferred scandal to food. She wore ivory silk anyway, not a bridal gown but a narrow dress with long sleeves and no embellishment. And she carried herself with such clean dignity that not even the cruelest eyes found an easy weakness to pick at. When Matteo entered the breakfast salon, conversations dimmed without fully stopping. He wore charcoal rather than black, as if grief had not yet earned its darkest color. And he crossed the room without looking at anyone but her. "Walk with me," he said. Emilia set down her untouched coffee and rose. No one dared interpret what passed across their faces. But half the room would spend weeks trying. The west gardens cascaded toward the sea in terraces of white roses. Lemon trees and old statues weathered into mournful softness. Staff withdrew when they saw them coming. A helicopter crossed the horizon in the distance like an omen. Matteo walked beside her with his hands clasped behind his back. The picture of restraint. But Emilia could feel the force of his thoughts the way one feels thunder inside stone before the sound arrives. "Who is the child?" he asked at last. She stopped walking. He had heard more than she hoped and less than he needed. "So that was the part you caught. Answer me. If I do, you'll go after the wrong man first." "There's a right man then." She looked out at the glittering sea. "There's a nest of right men." He turned toward her fully. Emilia. Her name in his mouth had never sounded gentle. Not even when he was careful. It always sounded inevitable. "You asked me once," she said, "why I kept the key my father left me when it brought only danger. You said any sane person would have thrown it into a river. And you said you weren't sane enough to abandon the dead. I found out what the key opens." Matteo said nothing. "And what waits behind it," she continued, "belongs to your family. But not to the people currently holding it." His jaw tightened. "Alaric is threatening you with a child. He's threatening the child with me." The shift in Matteo's face was minute, but she saw it. "Explain." "No," she said quietly, "not here. Not while his people are still in your house." They were watched even in a paradise built to hide power. Matteo knew it. He had built his life on knowing where eyes gathered, where microphones appeared, where loyalty was only fear wearing a cleaner suit. He led Emilia not back toward the villa, but through a side path lined with cypress and stone. Angels until they reached the old orangery. Abandoned after a winter storm had broken part of its glass ceiling years before. Sunlight spilled through the fractured panes in bright, dangerous strips. The room smelled of dust and citrus bark. Inside, away from staff, Matteo turned the lock himself. "You have 3 minutes," he said. Emilia looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time since midnight she allowed herself to show anger. 3 minutes? "You should be grateful it isn't less." Her eyes flashed, dark and steady. "And you should be grateful I still came when you asked." The silence between them sharpened. She was not frightened of him in the ways people assumed women should be frightened of powerful men. She was frightened of the machine around him, of the lies inside it, of what truth would do to a man who had already buried too much. "My father restored the lower crypt of your family chapel 2 summers before he died," she said. "He found a hidden recess behind the stone of St. Michael's altar. Someone had sealed it deliberately. He opened it, looked inside, and told no one except me. Why? Because he recognized the names on the papers. Your brother, your brother's wife, a child." Matteo's face did not move. But all the blood seemed to leave the room. His younger brother, Leon, had died 7 years earlier in a yacht explosion off Corsica along with his wife and infant son. Matteo had pulled half-burned wood from the sea with his own hands. He had buried sealed coffins. He had stood over 3 graves. "That child died," he said. "That child was declared dead," Emilia corrected. "Those are not the same thing." If she had struck him, the impact might have felt gentler. Matteo stepped back once, then again, as if balance had become a thing he could no longer assume. "You are very brave," he said, his voice suddenly colder than the marble floor. "Or very foolish. I know what I read. You're telling me my nephew lived while I buried an empty history? I'm telling you someone wanted you to believe there was no heir left except you." Matteo stared at her. "Alaric." She did not answer directly. And that answer was enough. "The boy is alive," she said. "He's 6 now. He has been moved more than once. There are guardianship papers, trust documents, medical records under another name. My father copied some of them before he hid them again. The originals are gone." "Where is the child?" I don't know yet. Amelia reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out a small iron key on a faded blue ribbon. This opens the recess. There's more behind it now than there was then. My father left me notes after he died. He believed someone knew he had found it. He believed if anything happened to him, I should take the evidence to a judge outside Italy. Matteo looked at the key but did not take it. And instead you brought it to me? Eventually. She gave a humorless breath that was almost a laugh. You were not a simple option. No, he said. I rarely am. She closed her fingers around the key again. Alaric found out I knew. He sent messages. He showed me a recent photograph of the boy to prove he had him. Last night he wanted me to persuade you to sign a revised trust transfer during the wedding celebrations. Something he would hide among the property documents. He said if I refused, the child would disappear permanently. Matteo's gaze sharpened. And you met him alone. Because if I told you before I knew where the boy was, you would have started a war in your own house. Perhaps it deserves one. Perhaps, Amelia said. But children rarely survive men's righteous wars. He took the key then. And his fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. Cold and steady, a different kind of memory crossed his face. One that had nothing to do with suspicion. Why didn't you trust me to handle it carefully? He asked. She looked at the broken glass above them, where sunlight cut the room into bright cages. Because every story I've heard about Matteo Vescara begins with control and ends with ruin. And what story have you written yourself? One where you are better than the men who raised you, she said. I just wasn't sure you believed it too. The answer landed deeper than accusation. Outside, somewhere beyond the orangery. Footsteps passed on gravel, paused, then continued. Matteo moved to the window, checked the garden. And when he turned back his expression had changed in a way Amelia had never seen. He was still dangerous, still furious. But fury was no longer pointed entirely at her. We open the recess now, he said. And if this is a trap, then I walked into it first, she replied. That ought to satisfy your pride. A shadow of something nearly amused touched his mouth and vanished at once. You think I'm proud? I think, Amelia said, that you've built a cathedral around your wounds and called it discipline. For the first time in 2 days. Matteo almost smiled. The chapel stood at the oldest edge of the estate, where the cliffs dropped sheer into black-blue water and salt had whitened the outer stones. It had been built by a Vescara ancestor who had paid for forgiveness in marble. The interior smelled of candle smoke and age. Frescoes peeled faintly above carved saints. The altar of St. Michael glowed beneath morning light, slipping through narrow stained glass. Matteo dismissed the 2 guards outside and locked the doors himself. Amelia crossed the nave with a certainty that made him wonder how often she had imagined this moment and feared it. Kneeling before the altar, she ran her fingers along a seam in the stone invisible to anyone who did not know where to search. The iron key slid into a recessed lock. A muted click answered. Then a square of marble released with the deep, reluctant breath of something hidden too long. Inside lay a leather packet, a rosary of black beads, a child's silver medal tarnished nearly dark, and 3 envelopes bound in string. Matteo did not touch the papers first. He picked up the medal. On one side was St. Christopher. On the other, engraved in tiny script, were the words for Leone, so he may always return. It had belonged to his brother. He had given it years ago when Leon became a father and could no longer bear the sudden terror that love placed in a man's chest. Matteo remembered fastening it around the infant's wrist one summer afternoon on a yacht deck while his brother's wife laughed and complained that the baby would chew it. He had forgotten that memory until the silver dragged it back like an anchor from deep water. For one brutal second he looked less like the head of a criminal empire than a son who had reached into a grave and found warmth. Open them, Amelia said softly. He did. The first envelope contained copies of baptism records from a coastal church in Corsica dated 2 weeks after the explosion that had supposedly killed Leon's family. The child had been entered under the name Elio Bardi. Guardianship temporary, mother listed as deceased, father omitted. The priest's signature was real. The second held a letter from Leon's wife, Katerina, written in a hand made unsteady by haste. Matteo recognized it instantly. If you are reading this, it means the arrangements failed or I no longer have the courage to trust the people around us. Leon believes someone inside the family is moving money through the charitable trust. He believes Alaric knows. If anything happens to us, protect the child from all legal guardians appointed by Viscara Council. Do not let them declare him dead. Matteo's vision narrowed. He read the last lines twice, because they would not fit inside the architecture of the world he knew. There was a third name beneath the witnesses. Domenico Rinaldi. Amelia's father. The third envelope changed everything else. It held handwritten notes from Domenico, sparse and practical. The way builders leave marks only another builder would understand. Found recess reopened, original documents removed. One photograph left behind. Boy alive approx, age 4 at date of photo. Man seen leaving Lower Chapel after midnight. Dorsini driver, unsafe to speak in house. If I die. Do not trust the senator. There was also a map, sketched roughly but unmistakably, of the lower foundations of the villa and a tunnel leading beneath the chapel cliffs toward an old boathouse long sealed after a landslide decades ago. Matteo read it in silence. Amelia watched his face as truth entered it like poison, like medicine, like something too strong to tell the difference between the two. There's more, she said. Alaric wanted whatever my father copied. He thinks I hid the rest. Did you? No, but I think my father did. Matteo folded the papers with exquisite care. Then we find it before Alaric does. The attack came before they reached the crypt stairs. One of the chapel windows shattered inward, sending colored glass across the floor like jeweled rain. And a silenced shot struck the stone column inches from Amelia's shoulder. Matteo moved before sound fully existed. He hit the floor, dragged her down behind the altar, and drew the pistol from the back of his waistband in one clean motion. Another shot cracked the plaster above them. Amelia pressed her palm over her mouth to stop instinct from becoming noise. Matteo's body covered half of hers without hesitation. Not possessive, simply tactical and absolute. He angled his head, listening, then whispered, "Stay." It was the only warning he gave before disappearing low across the nave with the controlled speed of a predator, who had learned violence young and refined it into mathematics. 2 more shots, a grunt, a body falling. Then silence again, heavier now. Amelia rose only when he called her name. The man bleeding beside the shattered side door wore no insignia, and would not have made it through the outer grounds without help. Matteo knelt long enough to search him, then stood with a keycard in one hand and fury banked behind his eyes. "He got past internal security," he said. "Alaric already knows we've opened this. Is he dead?" Amelia asked. Matteo glanced down. "Not yet. But he won't talk to me in time." She understood what that meant in his world and looked away. Not in judgment but in refusal to witness what could not be undone. He saw that too. "I won't do it here," he said. It was a strange promise, unasked for and somehow intimate. "I didn't ask you to spare him." "No," Matteo replied. "You ask me for very little. That's what makes it matter." He touched the blood at her temple where a shard of glass had cut her skin, and his thumb came away red. The contact lasted no longer than necessary. Yet it changed the air between them. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. You always say that when it's bleeding." He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it gently against her forehead himself. The care in his hands was almost unbearable after the coldness of the night before. "We leave now," he said. "Not through the front." The tunnel entrance lay beneath the vestry in a hidden trap sealed behind shelving once used for vestments. Salt dampened the lower stones. The passage smelled of earth, old seawater, and generations of buried family sins. Matteo went first with a flashlight. Amelia behind him carrying the leather packet beneath her coat. The corridor narrowed, turned, then opened into a chamber where carved support beams still bore the marks of tools from another century. "My father told me these existed," she whispered. He said every noble house built two things better than cathedrals: wine cellars and escape routes. He was right. Their footsteps echoed softly. Above them, the villa still held guests, servants, flowers. And the bright farce of postponed happiness below? They moved through the bones of it like two people already half exiled from their own lives. Why did your father keep this from you? Matteo asked after a moment. He didn't trust what knowing it would make me part of. And yet here you are. Yes, Emilia said. And yet here I am. They emerged inside the abandoned cliffside boathouse, where surf struck the rocks below with the rhythm of a threat. One of Matteo's security men waited there, summoned silently through an encrypted message sent before the chapel doors locked. He was older, thick-shouldered, with the flattened expression of a man whose loyalty had outlived comfort. "Car is ready," he said. "Plane?" Matteo asked. "Within 30 minutes, Matteo nodded. "No house route, no main gate. Tell no one our destination except Cesaro." The guard hesitated just enough to mean something. "Alaric is already asking after Signorina Rinaldi. He can keep asking." Matteo opened the rear door of the waiting black sedan and looked at Emilia. "Get in." She did, but not before asking. "Where are we going?" "France first," he said. "There's a chateau outside Avignon, owned through one of our foundations. My brother's trust had connections there. If Alaric moved the child through charities, the records won't all be in Italy. And the wedding guests? Let them mourn an inconvenience. And Alaric?" Matteo's gaze went colder. "Let him wonder how much I know." The private jet lifted from the Genoa airfield beneath a white afternoon sky. Inside, the cabin was all cream leather, polished walnut, and the kind of silence only money could buy well. Emilia sat by the window with the packet on her lap and a strip of medical tape above, her brow where the onboard physician had cleaned the cut. Matteo stood for a long time near the opposite seat, phone in hand, speaking in low bursts to people spread across Milan, Rome, Marseille, and Palermo. He gave orders without waste, each one narrowing the world into usable lines: freeze outgoing trust transfers, audit every charitable shell linked to Ducini Council, move loyal staff from the villa, find the priest who signed the Corsican record, find the driver named in Domenico's note. When he finally sat across from her, dusk had begun silvering the clouds. "Do you hate me?" she asked, surprising both of them. Matteo leaned back slowly. "For what?" "For not telling you sooner." He regarded her for a moment that felt longer than air travel and shorter than forgiveness. "I don't have the luxury of hating you yet," he said. "I'm still deciding whether to thank you." Emilia looked out at the wing cutting through the evening. "You do make tenderness sound like a legal threat. And you make secrets sound virtuous." "Sometimes they are. Sometimes," he said quietly. "They bury the wrong people." Night came over southern France in dark violet bands. The chateau, when they arrived, rose from a field of lavender gone shadow blue beneath the moon, its limestone facade lit by hidden ground lamps and centuries of money. A fountain whispered in the front court. Iron balconies cut elegant shapes against the walls. Matteo's family possessed half a dozen estates across Europe, but this one had belonged to his mother's line, and the sight of it seemed to sharpen him in strange ways. "She hated this place," he said as they entered the entrance hall beneath a painted ceiling of hunting gods. Emilia looked at him. "Your mother?" She said every room smelled like people lying politely. That almost made her smile. Was she wrong? No. A housekeeper, instructed before their arrival, led them to adjoining suites and informed them that records from the Foundation archives were being brought from the lower office. Matteo dismissed everyone after that. The door to Emilia's room opened onto a terrace overlooking vineyards washed silver by moonlight. She set the packet down on a carved desk and closed her eyes for one dangerous second. When she opened them again, Matteo was still there, one shoulder against the doorframe. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you. I'll do that when we know where the child is," she nodded. Then glanced toward the desk. "If you think I'll run, you can keep the papers." "If I thought you'd run," he said. You wouldn't have made it onto the plane. The archive room lay beneath the chateau library behind a concealed walnut panel that released with a pressure latch hidden inside a row of 19th century travel journals. Matteo and Emilia worked side by side until after midnight among ledgers, foundation reports, tax filings, shipping manifests, and folders labeled under charitable initiatives that had served as the family's cleanest public mask for decades. Hours passed in the smell of old paper and leather. At some point, Matteo removed his jacket and rolled his sleeves to the forearms. Emilia did not miss the scar near his left wrist. White against olive skin, old and clean. He saw her noticing it and said nothing. She also said nothing when she realized he read every line faster than anyone she knew and retained each figure with unnerving precision. "You should have been a judge," she murmured once. Exhausted. "I prefer outcomes," he said without looking up. Near 2 in the morning she found it. A string of foundation disbursements to a children's convalescent home on Isle Saint-Honoret. A private island facility long closed publicly but still receiving medical subsidies through 3 shell charities. The authorized signatory on the newest transfer was not Alaric, but a woman named Clarice Valmont, whom Matteo knew after one glance. "Alaric's goddaughter," he said. Board chair. Harmless in public, venom in private. Emilia traced the date with her finger. The last transfer was 6 weeks ago. Matteo's expression turned to stone. Then the boy was there 6 weeks ago, maybe still is. The island lay off the Cannes coast. A small private world of cypress, stone cloisters, and restricted docks used once by monks, and now by those who liked secrecy wrapped in heritage. They reached it at dawn by a sleek black yacht that cut through glass blue water under a sky just beginning to pale. The Mediterranean looked indifferent and perfect. Emilia stood at the stern in a cream coat borrowed from the chateau, wardrobe because the sea wind carried a cold sharper than expected. Matteo came up beside her with coffee and handed it over without ceremony. Their fingers touched around the cup. "When this is done?" she asked. Eyes still on the horizon. "What happens to him?" Matteo knew she meant the child, not Alaric. If he's Leon's son, he comes home. Home to what? Matteo was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "depends on whether there's anything left worth calling by that word." She turned then. "There is if you decide there is." He looked at her, truly looked. And something in his gaze softened despite himself. "You speak as if decisions are still clean things. They can be," Emilia said, "if you make them before vengeance does." The yacht slowed near the private dock. Men in discreet security uniforms waited on shore. One of them was sweating already. Money opened doors faster than virtue ever had. But Matteo did not use money first. He used names, then fear. Then the quiet implication that every lie told in the next 5 minutes would be remembered longer than anyone wanted. Within 20 minutes, the facility administrator had surrendered access to closed records and enough terror to betray her employer without realizing it. Leo had been registered there under the name Julian Moreau, 6 years old. Transferred for behavioral stabilization. Accompanied by private guardians. No outside visitors, last seen 3 days earlier. Transferred where? Matteo asked. The administrator trembled. "I don't know, I swear. You signed the release." A courier brought the order with Senator Dosinia's authorization. "The child was moved before sunrise. I never saw the vehicle." Matteo's fury made the room colder without changing its temperature. Emilia stepped forward before he could push too hard. "Did the child leave alone?" she asked. The woman swallowed. "No, with a nurse, Sister Beatrice. She'd been attached to him for months. Where would she go if she wanted to protect him?" The administrator hesitated. "There's an old retreat house inland. In the Estral Hills, it isn't official anymore. Some staff use it for private stays." Matteo and Emilia exchanged a glance. It was the first glance since the chapel that felt like partnership rather than collision. They found the retreat house above a red rock valley where pine trees clung to slopes like survivors. The building itself had once been a monastery and still held the severe grace of old religious architecture. Arched windows, stone cloisters, a bell tower facing empty countryside. Sister Beatrice opened the door with a kitchen knife in one hand and terror in her eyes. She could not have been more than 30. When she saw Mateo, she nearly slammed it shut. But Emilia spoke first. "We're not here to take him from safety," she said. "We're here because he is not safe where he has been." The nun's gaze flicked between them, landed on Mateo's face, and widened with recognition. "You're him," she whispered. "The uncle." Mateo said the word before he knew whether he could bear to hear it. "He's here." Sister Beatrice's grip on the knife loosened. "Sleeping," she said. "He had a fever last night." She looked at Mateo as if measuring not power but danger of a deeper sort. "If I let you in, I need your word the senator will never touch him again." Mateo's answer came without ornament. "If the senator comes within 10 miles of this door, he won't leave breathing." Emilia winced slightly at the brutality of it. But the nun, strangely, seemed relieved. She stepped aside. The child lay in a narrow bed in a room overlooking Cyprus and sun. He was very small for 6, all knees under blankets and dark hair damp at the temples. A stuffed fox missing one ear was tucked beneath his arm. On the bedside table stood a medicine bottle, 2 toy cars, and a watercolor of a yellow boat. Mateo stopped 2 steps inside the room and did not move again. Emilia had never seen fear transform a man like that. This was not the fear of guns or betrayal or losing power. This was fear of hope. The boy turned in his sleep. And when the light caught his face, there was Leon so clearly in the shape of the mouth and the angle of the brow that Mateo's hand closed against the doorframe hard enough to whiten the knuckles. He looked not furious now but wounded open. "He has my brother's eyes," he said, though the child's eyes were closed. "Yes," Sister Beatrice whispered, "when he smiles." "It's worse." Mateo gave a short, broken exhale that might have been a laugh in another life. He took 1 step closer, then another, and lowered himself into a crouch beside the bed with a care that belonged to no one who had ever feared him. He did not touch the boy. He only watched him breathe. Leo woke an hour later confused and glassy with fever. Staring at strangers through the distrust children learn when adults move them too often. Sister Beatrice knelt beside him and said, "These people came because they know your family." The boy's gaze landed on Mateo's face and stayed there. "You look like my dream," he said hoarsely in French-accented Italian. Mateo's throat moved. "Do I?" Leo nodded once. "There's a man in my dream on a boat. He says not to be scared of storms because my father wasn't." Mateo closed his eyes for a second that looked like pain. When he opened them, Emilia was watching him with a tenderness so quiet it could have gone mistaken for sorrow. "Your father was very brave," Mateo told the boy. Leo studied him. "Are you the bad man?" Sister Beatrice flinched. Emilia went still, but Mateo, after one stunned heartbeat, answered with more honesty than comfort. "Sometimes," he said. "Not to you." Leo considered that solemnly, then extended the stuffed fox. It was the closest thing to trust the child owned. Mateo accepted it as if taking custody of a heart. They remained at the retreat house through the day because moving a feverish child would have been reckless. In those hours, Mateo learned more than he had in 7 years of mourning. Leo had been told several names and belonged to none of them. He had nightmares about water and smoke, but loved bells, apricots, and toy engines. He trusted Sister Beatrice because she never lied when she did not know answers. He had a scar near his shoulder from an untreated infection. He drew boats when anxious. He asked Emilia, after only one afternoon, whether she knew stories about wolves that turned gentle near fireplaces. When she answered yes, he curled against the pillow and listened with grave concentration, while Mateo stood by the window pretending not to watch how easily her voice reached places violence never could. "He likes you," Sister Beatrice said later in the cloister garden while Leo slept again and Emilia washed paint from his fingers at an outdoor basin. Mateo looked out across the pines. "Children like anyone who kneels to their height." "Not him," the nun said. "He's been taught to fear men in beautiful suits." Mateo almost smiled at the description. "He should continue doing that." Sister Beatrice's expression gentled. You don't frighten him the way you think. At sunset, the first real fracture inside Matteo arrived. He stood alone in the bell tower with one hand on the stone ledge, looking over the valley while the sky burned copper and rose. Amelia found him there because she had begun to understand that when his silence grew too complete, it meant he was bleeding somewhere no one could bandage. Beatrice says the fever is down, she told him. Good. He did not turn. I had them bury an empty coffin, he said after a while. I stood beside my brother's grave and promised him I would protect what remained. There was still something left to protect, and I let other men sign it out of the world. Amelia moved beside him, close enough to share the last warmth from the sunlit stone. You didn't know. A convenient mercy. A cruel one, she corrected. Not the same. Matteo gave a faint shake of his head. Not the same. Not the same. Matteo gave a faint shake of his head. Matteo gave a faint shake of his head. Do you know what happens to men like me when we realize grief was managed for us? We become stupid. We stop distinguishing justice from appetite. Then don't become that man. He looked at her then, the dusk drawing harder lines across his face. And if I want to kill him? Amelia held his gaze. Want whatever you want. But do not hand him the victory of becoming your excuse. The words stayed between them, raw and necessary. Matteo reached up as if to touch her face, stopped halfway, and let his hand fall. That almost touch was more intimate than any kiss either of them had permitted. The next blow came from Milan before dawn. One of Matteo's lawyers called through the encrypted line with a voice stripped of every professional softness. Vascara Holdings had been hit with an emergency court order freezing key accounts, pending investigation into fiduciary misconduct and concealment of a minor error. Attached were anonymous statements alleging that Matteo had kidnapped a vulnerable child with the help of his fiancée, who had manipulated him for access to trust assets. Alaric had not chosen bullets this time. He had chosen paper, judges, media, bank signatures, and the exquisite violence of reputation. By breakfast, photographs of Amelia entering the retreat house and Matteo carrying Leo from a shaded courtyard appeared on 3 gossip sites and 1 financial newspaper. Gold digger caretaker, one headline suggested. Missing heir in mob succession battle, another declared. Sister Beatrice crossed herself when she saw it. Amelia set the phone down very gently. Matteo watched her from the other end of the old wooden table. Say something, he said. She lifted her eyes. You already know what I'll say. Say it anyway. He wants me humiliated until I run. He wants you provoked until you make a public mistake. He wants the child turned into evidence. Matteo nodded once. Good? Good? I'd prefer a visible enemy, he said, rising. To the invisible one I had yesterday. They moved Leo before noon in a convoy so discreet it looked accidental. 1 bakery van, 1 utility vehicle, 1 unmarked sedan, 1 medical car. Sister Beatrice came willingly. The new destination was not Italy but a fortified estate outside Aix-en-Provence belonging to an old ally of Matteo's mother, a widow named Madame Duplessis, whose fortune came from vineyards, and whose loyalty came from debts older than governments. Her property included a private clinic wing, gardens large enough for a child to vanish into safely, and walls high enough to insult artillery. Leo was installed in a blue room overlooking fig trees and a fountain shaped like a swan. By the time he fell asleep there that evening, he had already decided Amelia should read to him and Matteo should sit by the door, like a giant Wolf. Matteo accepted the title without comment. Later in the corridor outside, Amelia finally let some of the weight reach her face. He used my picture, she said. My father used to say lies are most dangerous when they dress in your own reflection. Matteo took the phone from her, looked at the article once, and smashed it against the stone wall. So hard, it burst into dark glittering pieces. The violence of it shocked the air. Amelia stared. Matteo's breathing stayed even. That, he said, was for my peace. Not yours. Against all reason, she almost laughed. Madame Duplessis received them that night in a salon of blue silk walls, portraits and candlelight reflected by near panels. She wore black lace, diamonds the size of prayers, and the expression of a queen too experienced to be surprised by male tragedy. Your mother would have hated this mess, she told Matteo after hearing the essentials. She always said Alaric smiled like a man who washed blood from his hands with rosewater. Matteo poured her wine himself. An act of respect. Did she ever say more? The old woman studied him. She said if your father died before exposing him, everything would become uglier than decent women should have to witness. Emilia sat very still. Did your father know? She asked. Madame Duplessis turned to her with unexpected warmth. My dear. In dynasties like these, everyone knows something and nobody knows enough until bodies appear. Matteo set the bottle down. Then I need enough. The widow nodded toward an inner cabinet. Your mother left a sealed box with me 3 years before she died. She said only one of her sons should open it. And only if Alaric ever tried to claim guardianship over a child in this family? Matteo went completely still. Where is it? In my archive, she said. And if I were you, I would prepare to hate the dead all over again. The box was cedar. Old and carefully preserved, inside lay a ring, a bundle of letters, and a cassette tape with Matteo's mother's handwriting on the label. If this is in your hands, I fail to destroy him in life. Matteo sat at a desk in the archive room while Emilia stood nearby, one hand on the chair back. And Madame Duplessis inserted the tape into an old player she kept for reasons suddenly less eccentric. Static hissed, then a woman's voice filled the room. Low and elegant and tired in ways illness cannot fully explain. Matteo had not heard his mother speak in 9 years. He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles blanched. If you are hearing this, said Alessandra Vascara, then either Leon distrusted the wrong person too late, or Matteo has discovered that the child lived. Listen carefully. Alaric Dorsini has been using the Charitable Trust and the Maritime Foundation to move assets, children and leverage across borders. Your father knew. He gathered documents. He meant to hand them to a magistrate in Geneva 3 days before he was to leave. He was poisoned. Emilia's breath caught. Matteo did not breathe at all. The tape continued. I could never prove Alaric ordered it. I only proved that the doctor who signed the death certificate bought a villa in Nice 6 months later. Leon wanted to go public. I begged him not to until we knew where every witness stood. If Leon is dead, trust no legal advisor appointed through Senate offices. Trust Domenico Rinaldi. He knows where the tunnel archive begins. And Matteo, if it is you who listens, do not become your father's blade. End this in daylight. When the tape stopped, the silence felt unnatural, as if the room itself had recoiled. Matteo stood so abruptly the chair struck the wall behind him. He crossed to the window and braced both hands on the frame, shoulders rigid. Head bowed once like a man hit somewhere too private for visible injury. Emilia approached carefully. Matteo, he laughed once. But there was no humor in it. He poisoned my father, buried my brother, hid his son, used my mother's voice to warn me from a grave. And all these years I thanked him at Christmas. You were a son, Emilia said. Not a fool. There's rarely a meaningful difference in families like mine. He turned then. And all the savage intelligence that made men fear him had focused into something colder than fury. I can have Alaric taken from the Senate chamber by tonight. Emilia heard the choice hidden in that phrasing, not arrested, taken. But? She asked. But my mother asked for daylight, he said. And you'll tell me she was right. Emilia stepped closer until only a breath remained between them. She was, she said softly. Because if you destroy him in shadow, everyone he corrupted gets to survive him. Matteo looked down at her. And if daylight costs Leo his peace? Then we build him a better one after. He lifted a hand and this time did touch her face, fingers brushing the cut near her brow as if checking she was real. You ask impossible things very calmly. Someone has to, she whispered. Neither moved. The room held its breath with them. Then footsteps passed in the corridor, and the almost kiss remained only almost. The letters in the box led them next to Geneva, to a private clinic on the lake where one name in an old payment ledger had reappeared under a disguised identity. Caterina Sara Vescara, Leon's widow, had not died in the explosion. She had been declared unstable after trauma-induced delusions, moved through 2 facilities, and kept under quiet sedation for years under a guardianship order signed by a judge now retired to Monaco. The lake outside the clinic shone like polished steel when Matteo arrived with legal counsel, medical experts, and enough influence to make administrators forget their lies quickly. Emilia came beside him not as decoration but as witness. They found Caterina in a sunroom overlooking white hydrangeas. She was thinner than grief should have allowed, silver beginning at her temples though she was barely 40. But when she looked up at Matteo, there was lucidity beneath the medication haze. Sharp and wounded. "I knew," she said before anyone spoke, her voice breaking on the second word. "I knew you would come too late." Because that was the story he chose for us. Matteo crossed the room like a man approaching a ghost he had no right to touch. "Where is Leon?" he asked, because some part of him had dared hope too much. Caterina closed her eyes. "Dead," she whispered. "He died the night of the fire, but Leo didn't. I got him onto another boat with Beatrice's sister. Alaric found us before dawn. He told the world I had drowned with my son and told me I was insane for saying otherwise. The legal process to free Caterina began that afternoon and turned instantly vicious. Alaric's network challenged signatures, contested competency, leaked selective medical notes, and fed television panels a neat little narrative about criminal dynasties inventing heirs to avoid prosecution. Matteo met it with better lawyers, cleaner records, and a patience so ruthless even judges noticed. Emilia spent hours with Caterina in the clinic garden, gathering not only testimony but courage. The older woman's hands trembled constantly until Leo's latest watercolor was placed in them. Then they steadied. "He has my husband's eyelashes," she murmured, tears slipping quietly down her face. "Does he remember me?" Emilia answered honestly. "Not clearly, but children remember safety in the body before they remember names." Caterina studied her. "And you? Are you safe with Matteo?" Emilia looked across the lawn where he stood speaking to counsel beneath an ash tree. Dark suit immaculate, profile hard enough to cut glass. "I think," she said, "I am safest when he stops pretending I am not inside his heart." Caterina gave a faint, sad smile. "Then you are already in danger. But perhaps for the better kind, by the time they returned to Provence." Leo had begun asking when the lady with the picture eyes would come. He meant his mother, though he did not know it fully. Matteo did not force the reunion. He arranged the room, the doctors, the exits, the soft toys, the nurse, the schedule, all the practical shields a man can build when he cannot protect anyone from emotion itself. Leo sat on a rug with toy trains while Caterina entered the room holding herself together by force of will. At first he only stared, then he looked at the watercolor she carried, the one he had painted days before, and frowned. "How do you have my boat?" he asked, her mouth shook. "Because," she said, dropping to her knees on the carpet, "you painted boats with me when you were very little." "Amor." Leo studied her face with that grave concentration children reserve for deciding whether wonder is safe. Then slowly, as if memory were rising through water, he crawled into her arms. Caterina made no dramatic sound. She just folded over him and wept into his hair with the devastation of years returning all at once. Matteo turned away. Emilia touched his sleeve and found it damp where his hand had left a mark from gripping too tightly. That night, long after the house had quieted, Matteo stood alone in the vineyard beneath a moon bright enough to silver the leaves. Emilia found him there because once one has loved a wounded animal, one can feel where it has gone to bleed. He heard her before she reached him and said, without turning, "They took 7 years from him." Yes. Without turning, they took 7 years from him. Yes. And from her? Yes. And from me? She came to stand beside him. Also yes. He laughed softly at the bluntness. "You have no talent for comforting lies. I thought we'd agreed I was done lying to you." The wind moved through the vines like a distant tide. For a while they simply stood there. Then Matteo said, When my father taught me to shoot, he told me mercy was often just vanity and expensive clothes. Amelia looked up at him. And what do you think now? I think men tell boys such things when they want them efficient and lonely. She smiled sadly. That sounds more like wisdom. He turned toward her. Moonlight made his face seem carved from the same pale ruthlessness as the statues in his Italian gardens. But his eyes had changed. There was exhaustion in them, and trust. Reluctant and dawning, and far more dangerous than rage. If I asked you to leave this before it gets worse, he said, would you go? Amelia answered without hesitation. No. Because you think I need you? Because Leo does, she said, then, after a beat. And because whether you like it or not, so do you. For one long suspended second he seemed to consider denying it. Instead he reached for her, not with hunger but with a terrible care. And kissed her as if he had already lost enough in this life to know the price. He kissed her as if he had already lost enough in this life to know the price of touching anything he wanted too much. There was nothing careless in it, nothing triumphant, nothing resembling the polished seduction that men of his power wore easily in public. It was a quiet undoing. His hand rested at the back of her neck with reverence so controlled it almost hurt. And Amelia, who had spent months guarding herself against his gravity, felt the terrible tenderness of being kissed by a man who never reached for softness unless he meant it. The vineyard, the moonlight, the cold silver air, all of it seemed to recede until there was only the muted rush of blood in her ears and the knowledge that Matteo Vascara, feared across cities and courts and ports, was kissing her like a confession he had no language for. When he drew back, his forehead hovered a breath from hers, and the restraint in him looked less like strength than survival. This changes nothing, he said, though his voice no longer believed in lies. Amelia's eyes stayed on his. Then why are you shaking? For a second he almost smiled. But what came instead was more intimate than humor. Because, he said, nothing in my life has ever changed quietly. The first sign that quiet would not be granted arrived before dawn. When one of the outer cameras on the Aches estate caught a black car idling beyond the east wall with its lights off. Too far for a license plate, too patient for coincidence. Matteo was already awake when the alert came through. Amelia found him in the security room dressed in a charcoal sweater instead of a suit. A detail so human it startled her more than the bank of monitors. Cesaro stood beside him, grim-faced, while footage rolled across screens in pale monochrome, wind through trees. The closed gate, the car motionless like a thought someone had not yet acted on. Local police? Amelia asked. No, Matteo said. They would pretend to patrol more convincingly. His tone was flat. But she had begun to hear the currents beneath it. He was thinking 3 moves ahead. Already calculating the cost of staying, the weakness of moving. The possibility that Alaric wanted not an attack but exhaustion. Do we leave? She asked. Not yet. Why? He finally looked at her. Because if we move every time he rattles the glass. Leo learns that fear is the architecture of home. Home. The answer silenced even Cesaro for a beat. Then Matteo turned back to the screens. But we change protocols. Nobody leaves the house alone. No calls on unsecured lines. And by afternoon I want the Monaco judge brought to Paris. The judge's name was Etienne Mercier. Retired, decorated, and discreetly rotten. He had signed one of the guardianship transfers keeping Katerina institutionalized and Leo erased. Men like Mercier did not respond well to threats from gangsters. But they responded very quickly to tax investigators. Mistresses with poor self-preservation, and the sudden freezing of offshore access. By noon he was in a private salon at the Hotel de Crillon in Paris, sweating into a silk pocket square while Matteo sat across from him beneath gilded moldings and a ceiling painted with impossible gods. Amelia remained near the window, not because Matteo wished to exclude her, but because Mercier, seeing her there, kept glancing at her with the guilty panic men reserve for decent women who witness their ugliness in daylight. I acted on certified psychiatric recommendations, Mercier said for the 3rd time, trying to make cowardice sound procedural. The mother was unstable. The child's survival could not be verified. Matteo stirred his espresso once without drinking it. You signed 3 sealed extensions after the child had already been medically documented alive. Mercier's hand shook. I relied on counsel. Alaric Dorsini's counsel. I was told the family itself wanted discretion. Matteo's gaze did not move. Which family member told you that? Silence opened like a wound in the room. Mercier looked toward Amelia again, as if perhaps she might rescue him by existing gently enough. She did not. At last he whispered. Your aunt. Matteo did not react visibly. That was always when the air turned most dangerous. My aunt has been dead for 2 years, he said. Mercier swallowed. Before that then? She met me in Monaco. She said your brother had been reckless. That a public dispute over succession would provoke war inside the family. That the child would be safer placed quietly until political conditions improved. Amelia felt the shift beside her more than she saw it. Matteo's aunt, Bianca Vascara, had raised him through half his adolescence after his mother's illness had worsened. Bianca had been difficult, iron-willed, impossible to impress. But Matteo had loved her in the hard, dutiful way children from fractured dynasties often love the only adults who stay. You have notes, Matteo said. Mercier blinked. What? Men like you document corruption when they fear the people paying for it, Matteo said softly. You keep private copies as insurance against the day everyone stops pretending to protect you. So I'll ask once more, do you have notes? Mercier's mouth opened, closed, then he nodded. At my apartment in Nii, in a wall safe behind the library panel, Matteo rose. Cesaro will retrieve them. If I cooperate, Mercier blurted. I want protection. Matteo looked down at him without mercy. But not without truth. You want time, he said. Protection is for men who remember the difference between law and laundry. Paris rained that evening in fine silver sheets that turned the Seine to brush steel and softened the city into something nearly merciful. Matteo and Amelia returned late to an apartment on Avenue Montaigne that belonged to one of the cleaner branches of his holdings. A high-ceilinged place of limestone fireplaces, museum-worthy art, and windows that made the city look invented by lonely architects. They were both exhausted, but neither had learned how to rest inside unfinished danger. Matteo loosened his tie while standing in the dark at the window. Amelia removed her earrings on the sofa and watched his reflection rather than his back. Your aunt, she said quietly. You didn't know. He gave a brief laugh that contained no warmth. It appears there are many things I did not know. There's a difference between not knowing and refusing to see. Is there? He turned at last. My family specialized in making both look dignified. Amelia studied him for a moment, then crossed the room until she stood within reach. If you want to break something, she said, do it before the child wakes tomorrow and sees your hands. A muscle moved in his jaw. You think I'm that close. I know you are. He looked down at his hands as if measuring them against the accusation. Bianca taught me to knot a tie, he said after a moment. She came to my school concerts when my father could not be bothered. She once slapped a senator for speaking to my mother like she was furniture. I buried her believing whatever sins she committed were merely the ordinary ones wealth trains into people. Amelia answered carefully. Loving what she gave you does not erase what she helped destroy. His eyes lifted to hers, dark with something quieter than rage and far older than shock. You say terrible things kindly. Someone has to, she murmured. When Cesaro returned from Neuilly just past midnight, the packet he brought was smaller than expected and far more lethal. Mercier's notes were handwritten in an obsessive legal script and organized by dates, locations, and personal leverage held against judges, doctors, trustees, and political donors. Bianca appeared in them 5 times, not as mastermind, as intermediary. As the family face used to make unnatural acts sound maternal. One entry mentioned a meeting at Castel San Vero, an abandoned Vascara property on the Ligurian coast, where the aunt insists the boy must remain legally absent until Matteo marries outside bloodline contamination. Amelia read that line twice. Outside bloodline contamination? Matteo's voice when it came was almost calm. It means Bianca knew there were questions about my own legitimacy. Emilia looked up sharply. Matteo did not meet her eyes. My father married my mother after an affair that became inconvenient. There were always whispers that I wasn't his by blood. Only by choice. If Leo lived and his son lived after him, some in the family would prefer a purer succession. The room seemed to tighten around the implication. And you never told me this, she said. Because it was gossip. Because it mattered to you. He did not deny it. In families like mine, he said. Blood is theology for people too weak to deserve loyalty. Emilia stepped closer to the table, reading further. Another note referenced an audio ledger held by Bianca, in event of Dorsini betrayal, stored in the crypt library of San Vero. Matteo's eyes followed hers to the line. Then we go back to Italy, he said. Tonight? Before dawn, with Leo? No. He looked toward the corridor where the guest rooms lay quiet. He stays in Paris with Caterina under Duplessis protection. We take only what can fight. Caterina did not want to let Leo out of her sight even for an hour. Much less while Matteo and Emilia crossed back into Italy to hunt ghosts in a castle. But she understood strategy better than anyone grief was supposed to have broken. At 4 a.m, beneath a chandelier dimmed to amber, she stood in a wool robe in the Paris apartment nursery doorway, watching Leo sleep with one hand against her mouth. Matteo waited a respectful distance away. If something happens to you, she said without turning. He inherits not your empire, but your mistakes. Matteo accepted that without flinching. Then I will try to return with fewer of both. Only then did she face him. In the softened light there were traces of the woman she must once have been in photographs beside Leon. Bright. Stubborn. Impossible to patronize. My husband trusted you more than he trusted himself, she said. That is why Alaric had to remove us before you understood the game. Matteo did not speak. Caterina's gaze shifted to Emilia. And you, she said quietly, are either the best thing that has happened to him or the last mercy he deserves? Emilia almost smiled despite the hour. I haven't decided which. Caterina surprised them both by taking her hand. Then come back alive long enough to decide properly. Castel San Vero rose from the Ligurian cliffs like a ruined vow. Once a fortified monastery, later a Vascara summer fortress. It had been shuttered after Bianca's death and left under caretakers whose loyalty came from fear and pension. The sea crashed black and white against the rocks below, as Matteo's convoy approached through cypress-lined roads still wet from night mist. The castle's towers cut into a paling sky. Ivy climbed old stone. Iron gates opened with reluctant groans. Emilia stepped from the car into air that smelled of salt, wet earth, and old secrets. It's beautiful, she said before she could stop herself. Most prisons are when the money is old enough, Matteo replied. His expression had turned inward, sharpened by memory. Bianca held Christmas here every 3rd year. My cousin once fell into the fountain and nearly drowned because no one noticed for 6 minutes. Everyone was too busy pretending to forgive one another. Emilia looked at him. Did you notice? I pulled him out. Then maybe not everyone was pretending. Matteo said nothing. The interior of San Vero was colder than the morning outside. Tapestries dulled by time hung over stone walls. A grand staircase climbed toward a painted dome showing saints ascending above swords and storm clouds. Caretakers had lit only the essential rooms. Leaving corridors and pools of shadow, Matteo dismissed them all to the front wing. He trusted silence more than servants. The crypt library Bianca had referenced lay below the old chapel. Past a sacristy and down a narrow stair hidden behind carved oak, the irony was almost vulgar. Every generation of the family had hidden its dirtiest truths beneath altars. Was there ever a moment, Emilia murmured as they descended with flashlights, when anyone in your bloodline considered therapy? Matteo glanced at her. It was the wrong time for humor, and therefore the only useful one. Once, he said. An ancestor commissioned an opera instead. The stairs ended at a steel door newer than the surrounding stone. Matteo examined the lock, then the hinges. Bianca updated this in the last decade. Can you open it? Yes. Will it be legal? Not remotely. He drew a small tool roll from his coat pocket with the efficiency of a man who had never believed doors were moral authorities. 30 seconds later the lock gave way. The room beyond was less a crypt than a private archive disguised as one. Climate-controlled. Lined with shelves, cedar boxes, ledgers, file cabinets. And 3 oil portraits of dead Viscara women who stared down as if guarding what men had failed to manage cleanly. A long table stood at the center beneath hanging lamps. Dust was light. Which meant the room had been entered more recently than the rest of the castle. Matteo saw it at once, so did Emilia. "We're not first," she said. "No," he answered, already moving. He checked cabinet drawers, scanned shelf labels. MEAESURD absences the way other men measured inventory. Bianca had organized everything obsessively: political donations, offshore trusts, marriage settlements, paternity arrangements, charitable restructurings. On the far wall stood a locked lacquer cabinet bearing her initials. Inside they found jewelry boxes, family seals, and finally a leather folio labeled in her hand, "If Alaric forgets his place." Emilia set the folio on the table while Matteo opened it. Inside lay transcripts of conversations, copies of wire transfers, photographs from receptions and boats and private meetings, a list of shell companies linked to missing youth placement funds, and, wrapped separately, a digital recorder no larger than a cigarette case. Matteo pressed play. Bianca's voice, dry and imperious, filled the room first. "You mistake me for sentimental. Alaric, I am only old." Then Alaric, unmistakable, smooth as polished poison. "And you mistake yourself for necessary. Matteo is useful but unstable. Leon is righteous but naive. And the child, if he survives, will be whatever we teach the courts he is." Emilia went cold. The recording continued in fragments, enough to prove conspiracy, fraud, and the deliberate suppression of an heir, enough to destroy careers, estates, and perhaps a republic's worth of respectable masks. Then Bianca said the sentence that changed Matteo's face completely. "Do not touch the Rinaldi Mason. He hid copies where even I cannot yet find them." Emilia stared. "My father." Matteo lifted a hand for silence. The recording crackled. Alaric answered, mildly amused. "If he becomes inconvenient, accidents can still be holy in old churches." Then the audio cut. For a long beat neither of them moved. The words sat in the room like smoke. Emilia's father had not merely died after finding danger. He had been marked, discussed, and almost certainly murdered for refusing to surrender what he knew. Matteo looked at her and saw not only grief but a harder thing underneath it. A terrible relief that finally had a shape. "You knew," he said quietly. Not with proof. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "Only in the way daughters know when a death arrives wearing the wrong weather." She turned away and pressed her palms to the table. Fighting for composure, Matteo came around the table slowly, as if approaching an injured creature that had every right to bite. "Emilia," she shook her head once. "He took my father because a mason opened the wrong stone in the wrong house." "No," Matteo said, low and precise. "He took your father because your father had more courage than the men who needed him silent." That broke something in her. Not loudly. Emilia never shattered loudly. Tears rose and spilled despite her discipline. And she laughed once through them in furious embarrassment, wiping at her face as if apology should be possible. Matteo caught her wrist gently. "Do not," he said. "Not with me." She looked at him, and whatever had been growing between them stopped being deniable. He pulled her into him, not to stop the tears, not to claim anything, only to hold. She pressed her forehead against his chest and let herself grieve for exactly 6 seconds before the sound of a door slamming somewhere above them tore the moment apart. Cesaro's voice cracked over the come. Movement in the west corridor. 3 men, maybe 4. "Not ours." Matteo released Emilia at once and drew his gun. The warmth of him vanished back into steel so quickly it was almost cruel. But she understood now that tenderness and danger lived in him adjacent. Not opposed, Take the recorder, he said. And the folio. What about you? I'm going to ask impolite questions. Matteo! He looked at her once. And whatever she intended to argue died there. If they came for this room, he said, then Alaric knows Bianca kept insurance. There may be no second chance. Footsteps thundered overhead. Cesaro swore in Italian. Another guard shouted. Then a shot rang out. Muffled by stone but unmistakable, Matteo killed the lights in the archive with one switch and grabbed her hand. There's another exit, he said. Bianca never trusted one door. He pulled a hidden latch behind the third portrait. A panel released inward to reveal a narrow passage vanishing into black. Go, he ordered. Emilia did not move. Not without you. Emilia. No. Somewhere above. Glass shattered. Men were coming down the stair. Matteo stared at her for the shortest, fiercest second of his life, and then made a choice he had not intended ever to make so nakedly. He touched her face with the back of his hand. If they corner us, he said softly. You run with the truth, not with me. Her breath caught. Don't ask that. I'm not asking. Then I refuse. The ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Broken and proud and almost unbearably alive. Of course you do. The first attacker reached the outer door just as Matteo fired through the dark. The shot echoed like a bell in the stone chamber. A body hit the wall. Another man shouted. Cesaro returned fire from the corridor above. Matteo pushed Emilia into the passage and followed backward, one arm shielding her as he fired again at the opening. Forcing the intruders to hesitate, the hidden door swung partly shut behind them, leaving only a wedge of yellow hall light and the violent noise of men who had expected papers. Not resistance, the passage sloped downward. Damp and narrow, old masonry scraping their shoulders. Emilia clutched the recorder beneath her coat while the folio banged against her ribs. Matteo moved by memory now, or instinct. Or the cursed fluency of a life spent learning where noble families buried their exits. Another shot rang behind them closer. Stone chipped near Emilia's ear. Matteo cursed, turned, and fired once more through the narrowing seam. Then the hidden door slammed fully and plunged them into dark, so complete it erased even fear for a second. He clicked on a penlight. The tunnel ran ahead in two directions. From behind the sealed door came a muffled voice. Smooth even through stone, Matteo, Alaric called. As if they were discussing seating arrangements instead of murder. If you go left, the tunnel collapses after 30 meters. Bianca never repaired it. If you go right, you'll emerge at the sea gate. Where my men are waiting, I do hate untidy choices. But I'm afraid this one belongs to you. Matteo's gaze lifted to the darkness ahead. Emilia tightened her grip on the evidence, and somewhere far away in Paris, a sleeping child still believed storms could be survived if the right man stayed on the boat.